CD Eskilson is a trans non-binary poet and translator. They are a recipient of the C.D. Wright Academy of American Poets Prize, and their work appears in the Kenyon Review, Beloit Poetry Journal, The Offing, Passages North, Hayden's Fairy Review, and others. Their debut poetry collection, Scream Queen, is forthcoming from Acre Books in 2025. Modern Woman, CD's translation of Finland-Swedish poet Edith Södergran's groundbreaking 1916 poetry collection, will be published by World Poetry Books in 2026. I met CD while they were completing their MFA at the University of Arkansas, and our paths crossed again when they worked as the series coordinator for the now defunct Open Mouth Literary Center. How are you?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm good. I love the Halloween shirt.
Yes, had to be on theme.
Yeah. I knew I had to wear black for your episode for sure.
Very exciting.
So you're in LA. Have you been impacted at all by the fires?
Yeah, a little bit. The power was out for a couple of days here in our apartment, so we had to kind of go over to my parents' house. I've known a lot of folks that, had to be evacuated or sort of had to move, and then everybody at this point kind of knows someone who lost their home. So just sort of in that way, but doing fine. It was a whole, week and a half, 2 weeks, and it will be a lot kind of going forward, but it's been all right for us personally. Yeah.
And thank you so much for answering the AWP question. I still haven't actually bought tickets or anything for AWP. I'm kind of considering going. I told Patricia last week that I was going, but are you still thinking that it's a good idea to go?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, the area is not anywhere near where the fires are, so that's not necessarily an issue in terms of housing or anything like that. At this point, most folks have sort of settled into places that are, if they've relocated, it's further away, and also if they're going to be near that area of downtown, I think it's fine. I think it will be fine. Yeah, I think it'll be fine.
Okay.
Yeah, it's kind of I think with an area like LA, also, I think it's the size, and then also the fact that sort of people are regularly still coming here is kind of hard to control. When I go to work, I see the buses full of people in Hollywood going through there. I'm people are still doing that. Kind of hard to stop that. But, yeah.
Okay, good to know.
Yeah.
All right, let's just dig into the questions.
Yeah.
Tell me how you ended up at Arkansas.
So I ended up in the Arkansas MFA for a couple reasons. I'd heard really good things, about the program, the rigor of, having that sort of unique 4-year structure. Also, the sort of another thing, unique about the program is having a translation track, which I thought was really kind of exciting or interesting. So I kind of, looked at that and applied based on that. My spouse's family is also from Mississippi, still lives in Mississippi, and sort of that wanting to be a little bit closer was also a motivating factor. So being, a little bit closer where we could go visit a little bit more, but, still a little bit removed. So kind of all those things together led us over there, and we had a really good experience.
Well, one benefit to being at Arkansas is benefiting from Jeffrey Davis's impact. Can we talk a bit about Jeffrey and how he impacted your work?
Yeah, because we both got to work with Jeffrey as an advisor for theses. I think for me, Jeffrey was something offered sort of a presence and an intentionality with workshopping, with sort of organizing a larger project that I think I really needed. This sort of idea of sort of embracing uncertainty, sort of also finding more peace within the creative process. I'm someone that's very sort of intense about writing in a way that, can be good, but also applies a lot of pressure to aspects of like revision or, getting stuff out there and sort of, drafting sort of a lot in a very sort of like confined amount of time. Which, production is good, but when you're sort of in that mode for a long time, it can be exhausting, but then also sort of you can miss some of the bigger picture. I think something that I got out of my relationship working with Jeffrey Davis was this idea of sort of, stepping back and figuring out where you are in sort of a bigger artistic conversation. I think before that, I also didn't really know if I had like the permission to do that, is to be like, oh, this is what I think about form, or this is what I think about this particular kind of form or kind of poem or larger, capital letter concept. So I think that was something that, working with someone like Jeffrey really kind of opened up for me, is I can do that sort of theoretical work as a poet of being like, this is what I think about image, or this is what I think about description, that I didn't really think about as much before, or didn't think I could think about. Yeah, I think that was just sort of a very sort of monumental shift for me. It was thinking more theoretically or aesthetically in a bigger sense. Yeah.
You're actually my second guest who was a former advisee or
Oh,
mentee of Jeffrey.
yeah.
Yeah. So my first one was Bailey Hutchinson,
Yeah.
and she wrote Gut, and now you've
Yeah.
written Scream Queen, and
Yes.
I had Sea Monkeys. So like, what is that? Like, why are we all so creepy?
I don't know. It's so funny because Jeffrey is just such a like mellow, fellow, soft-spoken, pretty, non-creepy person. So yeah, we have all these, you know, really disturbing projects in that sense, at least for me. And then Bailey's book has that really wonderful cover that is just so awesome with like the worm horse princess. I don't know. I'll have to ask him because he's just not a creepy person.
Yeah, I feel like it's so weird that there's just like these weird dualities happening, and yeah. Okay, let's talk about Scream Queen. Tell me more about the title and how you arrived at it.
Yeah. So, on a literal level, a scream queen is sort of a concept from horror films. It denotes the sort of, you know, an actress or an actor, which also happens, who sort of starred in a number of horror films, starred in a number of sort of protagonist roles within horror. So, folks like older, like Jamie Lee Curtis from Halloween, who was also in Prom Night. You have Neve Campbell, like in Scream, being across all those sort of different iterations of Scream. And then, some more modern interpretations are people like Jenna Ortega, or like Mia Goth. But so the sort of like, concept of people in some ways, being typecast or just sort of really like being interested in being in horror films, there's sort of this like cyclical implication behind it, throughout this actor's career. They're sort of repeatedly thrown into these sort of, very violent survival based films, or, like ultimately the goal is hopefully that they survive the film. The Scream Queen typically survives. But this sort of positioning of like, gender-based violence and sort of the cyclical nature of it sort of, parallels in some ways, like some of the themes I'm talking about with gender, particularly, with trans and non-binary people. There's sort of this like, unprovoked cyclical and structural sort of attack that's happening throughout the book. So it felt sort of fairly appropriate to kind of, have that as sort of our entry into that with the title, is this idea of horror and its ongoing repetition throughout people's lives.
What horror film tropes do you think resonate strongest in your writing?
Yeah, so something that's like related to the concept of like a scream queen is this idea. It's related, but kind of different. Is the idea of like the final girl, which is sort of like a film concept that came up in the 90s. This film critic, Carol J. Clover, wrote a book called Men, Women, and Chainsaws, that sort of unpacked this and sort of looked at some different examples But identified that, the female leads in slasher films are sort of occupy this like complex sort of slant gender position. They have a lot of sort of like masculine coded traits, or sort of, are complicated in the way that they present gender. Um, it also sort of complicates the way that like the villain, or like, the Michael Myers of the film, has sort of like a compromised position, or sort of, I would say, queer relationship to gender. Um, yeah, so I sort of, this concept has been rattling around in my head for a while, since I kind of like learned about it, and I always thought it was very interesting. Um, and I think there's sort of, there are ways to sort of update it. And what I think the book tries to do is sort of, reimagine or rework that concept with respect to queerness, and sort of trans interpretations of horror, the idea of, the sort of positioning outside of what's considered like a typical gender representation, or sort of a typical experience of the body, and the ways in which that sort of, prompts or sort of puts one in this position relative to violence. Yeah, so that's sort of like a theme that comes up within the Scream Queen a lot. There's a series of poems called Prey, that kind of directly deals with that, and sort of looks at some different aspects of horror theory or horror sort of examples throughout time, and sort of plays that off of, this present moment with trans and non-binary folks in relationship to what's going on the state level or personal level. Yeah.
Do you think the homage to the horror genre at all impacted the book's development and organization?
Yeah. So the way that the sections are broken up, there's 5 sections in Scream Queen, and they're all titled after sort of different tropes or subgenres of horror. So there's a section called body horror. And the sections sort of like mirror, or like sort of speak back to that trope within like their organizations. Like the poems in that section sort of work with that theme directly or indirectly. So like the body horror section, which, plays off of this sort of subgenre of horror, so things like The Substance are considered body horror, or, films by someone like David Cronenberg, who did like The Fly. But there's a sort of like idea of like the grotesque in the body as the sort of like horrifying and frightening thing. And a lot of the poems in that section sort of deal with, chronic illness, experiences of like gender dysphoria, and sort of like one's position of the body that way. There's another section called Jump Scare, which sort of, connects more to that idea of like the ways that, sometimes you get startled in films, is that sort of, that trope of like someone popping out of the darkness or something. And that deals a little bit more with like sort of experiences of like interpersonal, like gender-based violence. It's sort of like a less literal interpretation, but sort of emotionally resonant with this idea of like responding, and like sort of the physical sensation of that panic. Yeah, so that sort of came to me as I was sort of like thinking through like how horror is such a big concept, and like wanting to find some sort of like method to navigating that. And that sort of stuck out to me as I was like, looking through the poems and trying to organize them, is like how to make sense of that for me was like thinking about themes, or thinking about that rather than some other way. So yeah, it definitely sort of played into the structure of the book.
Jumping down to the audience questions real quick to get more of like a background question. Saba Karamati asked, what first drew you to the horror genre as a reader slash watcher? How did you decide, and her question cut off, so
Yeah.
rest of her question. How did you decide to structure your debut around it?
Yeah, thank you, Saba. That's a really good question. I think for a lot of folks, um, a lot of queer folks, a lot of trans folks, I think a lot of folks that sort of occupy what we would sort of call like a, like a marginalized position, or sort of like in reference to like sort of like a dominant social cultural group. I think horror speaks to a lot of people, as a way of sort of understanding their own position to, like that in-group, out-group thing. For me, as like I liked horror, or, found some sort of solace or some sort of like connection to it since I was a little kid. I used to, like, before going to kindergarten, my mom used to put on like the Wolfman VHS tape. And I would watch that sort of religiously. There's that and Creature of the Black Lagoon, sort of cycling between the two. Um, yeah, so that was sort of my entry to it, is like finding sort of a way to connect with the way that like sort of monsters are portrayed, and like the like really is sort of the idea that at a certain level, like horror is more about the society or the culture that sort of creates this idea of a monster rather than like the monster itself. Is like with the movie like Frankenstein, like Frankenstein, the monster isn't the monster. The sort of way that society like rejects this person, rejects this sort of creation that had no fault other than just being created. Says a lot about this present moment too. Um, yeah, I think as I was sort of thinking through and writing sort of in response to this moment of gender-based panic, just larger sort of, reactions to sort of violently enforcing what people can and can't do with their own bodies. That sort of initial sort of childhood comfort within horror, within stories about monsters, came back to me as sort of a way of speaking back to that. Like sort of that language or that sort of like familiarity with the experience of, being a kid and feeling different or feeling sort of outside how other people are, and finding solace in this sort of media object kind of just came back that way. Um, yeah. And that's sort of like, as I was writing these poems, it just became more and more obvious that like that had to be the dominant theme. To kind of ignore that it would just be a very different book or speak to a very different experience. And that was sort of my way of speaking to the moment, was through horror.
You do touch on this a little bit, but process-wise, can you talk a bit about where film and poetry intersect?
Yeah. So, um, first off, the poet Ellie Black, who is from Arkansas and currently lives in Mississippi, which is a very cool sort of coincidence for the two of us, I think. Um, Talks a lot about horror, and I just wanted to sort of shout them out for being someone kind of who started this with like they had a horror poetry workshop where I first started thinking about this stuff. But I think the intersection for me within horror film poetry comes down to like sort of where like energy comes from, or where both sort of like create tension or create motion. And I think like metaphor and imagery and like images sort of are where that happens for both horror and poetry. So like if we're looking at metaphor, both horror films and poetry are sort of driven by this like inherent mystery to them. There's like this, there's like the literal plot level of what's going on, but then there's obviously something more going on as well. There's something beneath that's sort of unsaid, or sort of through our understanding as readers, we kind of come to see as sort of not literal. So like, like a poem, like a Robert Frost poem or something like The Road Not Taken, it's about like the speaker and these two different paths, and like it's about that, and like that's sort of being told that it's not just a mirror representation. Like there's more being said about like choice, or like the futility of making choice. And horror is the same. This idea of like transcending the literal. So like like a movie like Texas Chainsaw Massacre, it's super violent, it's super gory, it has sort of this like grotesque aspect to it, but it's not doing that to just do that. There's like this larger metaphor about sort of de-industrial America going on, and sort of like the violence of the family. So I would say like in terms of metaphor, both horror and poems are sort of doing this really interesting work of saying something, revealing something that's sort of beyond literal. And then like as images and like with imagery, horror and poetry are both very sort of like image heavy, and sort of there's so much tension or so much risk that comes from this idea of sort of describing and immersing us in that. So obviously a movie like Halloween does some really interesting stuff with like cinematography, and how it sort of demonstrates the movie starts from the perspective of Michael Myers and sort of, creates this weird tone, creates this sort of like intense sort of like stake to it. Like there's really intense stakes with the movie starting from like the killer's perspective. And I think, when we think about poems, is there's this same sort of like question of like what vantage point is a poem coming from? Where does the power come from in, an image is if we dwell on like in like the road not taken or something, if we dwell on like what the road looks like or something, or what it seems like to the speaker, it's like those are also lots of choices being made as well. It's like why do that? I think is a question, at least for me, is like horror is sort of helped reveal that. It's like, why am I representing an image this way? Or like what power is it getting that way? So I think there's a lot going on between the two of them. There's a lot sort of to learn from watching movies. It's not just watching movies. You can learn a lot about writing poetry that way.
Absolutely. I thought it was a fascinating lens to look at a whole like collection of poetry. But I wonder at what point in the writing or development process did the book's overarching themes and that horror lens become apparent to you?
Yeah. So with this particular book, I think horror was sort of and has been. I don't know. It feels weird to say like the book is done still to me, just because like it's hard to accept that, I think. But with the book, horror, it was sort of always like a thematic presence, I think, within the book. I think with wanting to write this sort of direct or sort of speak back to these things that are very frightening or like very sort of like intense and very unnerving, as gender-based violence or violence against queer people, and sort of like also just navigating that own process of like understanding oneself and sort of like the shock that could be. I think horror felt like a very sort of like natural way of making sense of that to me. Yeah, like as the poems are being written and sort of in the last couple of years, and sort of this ratcheting up of like vilifying folks who are queer or trans, sort of continuing and getting sort of worse and worse to the point where it's at now. I also just sort of like to see the parallels even more. Is like it sort of initially started as a concept of like, oh, it'd be interesting to sort of write through that lens, but then it continuously felt more urgent as sort of like the language of like news and the language of sort of like of politics sort of literally feels like it's pulled from some of these movies sometimes, in terms of like how people are talked about or how they're represented. So it felt like a way of interrogating that rhetorical violence and sort of maybe taking some of that power back, is to position the poems from like a horror perspective. Yeah, and something that was also like very sort of monumental, made it very hard to shake, was I got lent this book by the wonderful poet Dare Williams. He lent me this book called This Young Monster by Charlie Fox, which is like a nonfiction book that examines similar things, just like a media landscape perspective of like horror and monsters, why we think about monsters so much. And that kind of like got stuck in my brain. So I like couldn't shake that as I was writing. Like the book came later than that, but like it sort of just kept rattling around, and like seeing that it was possible just made me want to like do it more, I think. Yeah.
So it's really unusual to have a slash in a title, and then you also like I think every section also has a slash in its title, and I wondered if you could speak a bit about those slashes and what they represent.
Yeah, so there's a couple different levels that the slash is working on. Um, it sort of mirrors the way that we disclose pronouns when we write them out. Sort of on paper, there's she slash her, they slash them. What sort of stood out to me was like there's this sort of visual and like verbal distinction, though, is that we don't say the slash. Like we say she, her, they, them. And that sort of like distinction in like custom was always kind of interesting to me. So I was kind of curious, like with the title and like with the sections, like what it would mean to sort of play with that idea of like verbal and nonverbal sort of like partitions, and like what it means to kind of like create a pause or create a break that's compromised in that way. So like with the section breaks, as we kind of go through these different like subtopics of horror and go through these different subgenres, the slash is in the middle of them, but sort of as the book progresses, the words become sort of joined more. So like we start with like, you know, a two-part word, or like a two-part phrase like found footage or body horror. By the end of the book, you know, we get something like supernatural is broken up with the slash. So there's sort of this bisecting that's happening, this like rupture. And I was really like, intrigued by the idea of like, yeah, like how would people receive that, or like sort of on like a level of playing with language. We're creating this binary. We're creating this sort of like construction of like, this is one side of the word, this is the other, but it's all one word. We know it's one word, which feels kind of like, you know, gender construction. It's like we're creating this sort of like arbitrary position of like division where people decide this is this part, this is this other part, but we know it's sort of like a whole word being spelled out. Um, yeah, it felt sort of part of what the book in its poems was also getting at, was probing why these divisions exist. How do we sort of break out of them? How do we sort of like navigate them as people?
That's fascinating. I can't believe I didn't think about that, like just from like the pronoun standpoint. But I love that there's this, well, I don't love this, but it's so interesting that there's also this like inherent violence in it because it's a slash, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's fascinating.
Slash is a
Speaking,
weird word too. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. Speaking of the book, I woke up to a message from the University of Chicago saying that it had shipped, the pre-order. So it sounds
Yeah.
like people are going to be getting the book soon.
Yeah, they're coming out. I keep checking the mail. I'm supposed to get my copies soon too. Yeah, every hour go down and check my mailbox. But yeah, they have shipped. They are going out soon. Very excited for it to be in the world.
I wanted to ask you about the zine because I
Yes.
filled out the form and I was wondering like when that comes through.
Yeah. Let's see. I have it right here. Um,
Ooh.
so they're getting made. They are going to be shipped when I get them. So I'm gonna like start mailing those out. I wasn't quite sure when the books were gonna get mailed, so I was like trying to time ordering them all at the same time, but they will be going out soon. So hopefully the next like couple of weeks you will get that as well.
Very cool. I didn't even know it was going to be a hard copy. I expected an e-copy, honestly.
No, yeah, it's a physical, the power of Canva. To make stuff on Canva. But yeah, and then sort of goes through different stuff. Yeah, just some different sort of horror movies being talked about, because I can't not talk about horror movies.
That's so exciting. Okay, back to punctuation. At times, you end poems with semicolons, and I thought that was so interesting. Could you talk a bit about that and maybe like how you hoped readers would encounter those moments?
So punctuation and sort of, you know, like these elements like slashes, these sort of like non word based, I don't know what to call them, like yeah, like sort of like glyphs or graphic marks, kind of come out of this question I had writing the book, is sort of this tension about like language and language's relationship to violence, or language's relationship to sort of like social structures. Is there's sort of like when you look at like any kind of language or anything like that, there's sort of these, it feels like, you know, patriarchal components built into them on like a certain functional level, or there's sort of like the way that we discuss things, the rhetoric we use is sort of infected by a violence, and like a gender-based violence or a queer-based violence. There's this sort of demand for normativity, this demand, you know, things be talked about in binaries or be talked about in this objective way. You know, grammar itself, yeah, like we do things because it's the rule. And it sort of had this tension as, you know, as someone trying to write in response to or think outside of that kind of like patriarchal violence, is, how can you write about something through that, like that rhetoric itself is like you're using that language to sort of speak back to that language, but it feels like how can you escape that? So for me, I was trying to on like a level of punctuation or with these different marks, like the slash. I think I have like I have brackets and other poems as well. A lot of that's sort of coming out of this idea of sort of creating a new way of expressing oneself or creating sort of a new rhetoric that's rooted in more sort of fluidity or more multiplicity, more sort of space also. So the semicolons in particular are sort of a way for me when I was writing to kind of reimagine like space or pause and sort of uncertainty is, semicolons are such a strange punctuation mark. They, have like an indeterminate amount of space that they offer. They're not a comma and they're not a period. There's sort of this very qualified pause. They're very sort of like non-binary coded to me because they're like existing between the full stop of a sentence and sort of like the blip of a comma. So for me, yeah, the semicolons offered this sort of way of like resisting like a clean ending to a poem or resisting like the idea of like the poem is done, we're on to the next thing, I figured everything out. Is yeah, there's sort of like these questions that linger within a poem that, aren't yet determined or aren't yet sort of like resolved that felt very important for the book.
You seem incredibly well acquainted with yourself throughout the book and also just like speaking about it now. I'm curious to know how much of that comes through initially in your writing and how much of it is a result of careful pruning and revision.
Yeah, it's really funny because I like have a really hard time verbalizing my emotions or talking about stuff typically. I'm working on it, but yeah, it's very weird because I find writing poems offers more of like an open field for processing for me. So there's something that feels very freeing about that. And sort of through the drafting process, it is fairly candid. It is fairly sort of early on in the drafts that there's that sort of revelatory aspect or, things sort of come out of it that I wasn't expecting. Um, yeah, so like a lot of that sort of comes out initially and then sort of it gets made to sound nicer or look nicer as I'm sort of revising it. But I do think like the whole process of writing Scream Queen sort of changed my relationship to myself, kind of amplified that a lot. Like, the idea of having to sort of like articulate a desire or sort of commit my emotions to a poem or like to the language of a poem kind of made me think more about like what I was aspiring to personally and sort of like holding accountability for like the things I wanted from myself and kind of what I wanted to work towards. So to kind of answer the question is like, yes, it came out and then it also felt like it got easier as the book went further, it got bigger or sort of developed more as well.
That makes a lot of sense. And on a similar note, some of the most searing moments to me as a reader were acknowledgments and recognition of that knowing, and also its sometimes ultimate futility. Could you speak a bit about your thoughts on that sort of illumination and what can come from it? Speaking specifically of the quotes, nobody told me knowing would do little. I'd still end up a house falling. And I ponder an inheritance of seeking fear, how to my family pruning would be murder, not possible new growths.
Yeah, I think as a person that's been very since I was a kid and sort of, even the idea of wanting to go to grad school and sort of continuing education that way, I've been very preoccupied with this idea of knowing and the idea of, where the sort of that axiom that's always says like knowledge is power, or like, there's this sort of way that we think about knowing or knowledge in this very sort of like we keep it or we can hoard it or we can sort of, see it as a source of, social capital or some sort of way of sort of being better than other people or bettering ourselves through knowing. But I think there's sort of like this there are limitations to that. Like I think I've sort of started to question the idea of like the inherent power of knowledge without action or without some sort of intention or sort of way of making sense of what we know. And I think particularly the idea, the quotes that you were talking about, um, those poems sort of directly address ideas of like inheritance and the idea of understanding and knowing, about one's family or one's sort of history. We can know those things, but knowing itself isn't enough to break cycles of mental illness or trauma or um, just knowing doesn't fix a problem. We can identify the cycles, we can identify these environments that sort of impact our lives, but we can end up repeating them. And if we're sort of seeing ourselves repeat them but know we're repeating them, we're not necessarily putting a stop to those behaviors. So I think a lot of poems in the book sort of like question this idea of like revelation on its own. And like revelation as an idea within poems, poems sort of, have this like moment of epiphany, the volta of a poem sort of, tells us what it's all about. And it's all great after that, allegedly. But I think the book in those poems is sort of trying to do more or go beyond that. So I think the active lived component also comes through some other poems, and sort of kind of hinges on that those moments where I think the horror sort of plays off the most, where we get characters, we get these speakers like Buffalo Bill or King Payman from Hereditary, that movie, where the speaker sort of has to confront that idea of knowing, where these monsters or monstrous figures are sort of telling them like, you need to go live your own life, you need to like figure this out, you need to kind of do the actual living part because you know things, but you need to enact that change yourself. So yeah, that was sort of my way of thinking through that sort of hesitation about revelation was, the speaker needs to go do the things that they want, enact those and realize those goals.
Are you at all an Edgar Allan Poe fan?
I was when I was a kid. I thought he was very interesting. I had like a really big sort of like Edgar Allan Poe like anthology. Um, I wasn't like a super fan, but I liked him. I liked The Telltale Heart was like a fun book we had to or a fun story we had to read in like middle school that I kind of thought was really creepy and cool. But yeah.
That's so funny. And this is probably incredibly reductive, but I felt like A House Falling was very Poe coded.
Yes. Yeah, House of Usher. Yeah. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Is how the how that kind of works. I mean, but that is, yeah, like the idea of the Gothic is a very sort of it's very like domestic tragedy, domestic drama driven. So I don't think that sort of like analogy or sort of like observation is wrong because yeah, like in poems, talking about like the inheritance of like mental illness or sort of dealing with like with family history. I think that that's definitely there is this idea of you know what's been built and what's decays and sort of how do we navigate that. I didn't even think about that.
I feel like sometimes things just come up that are just like living in our subconscious. So, and all us creepy kids are always thinking about Poe, aren't we?
We are always thinking about Poe. Poe is everywhere.
I actually, this was totally unintended. It was just because of Libby holds coming up. But around the same time that I was reading your book, I was reading a very long biography or like memoir type thing that was just like all about the history of Poe and everything that
Oh,
happened to him. So it just so
that's so
happened.
sweet. Yeah, that's such a he has such a strange life because like I believe people think he was like he died because he was like in some sort of like voter fraud scheme that they used to do in like the 1840s. They like rounded people up and had them vote a bunch of times, but he was like drunk. I mean, I don't know if you found that out in the book, but yeah, he had this sort of like mysterious death.
Yeah, actually the book was about his death and like all the
Oh,
theories surrounding it. And it ended by basically saying that the response is probably tuberculosis. So I learned a lot
Um,
about tuberculosis in the process. But yeah, no, all of it's fascinating.
that's weird. Okay, I'll have to read it. That's cool.
Do you have a favorite poem in Scream Queen?
Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. No one never, I don't know, I've never been asked that. And I feel like it probably changes, but the poem I think about the most, or haven't gotten tired of reading yet, is Update on Him from Powerpuff Girls. It's one of those ones that sort of, positions this monster or this figure from horror, this one being the sort of spooky, devilish looking him from Powerpuff Girls. And the speaker sort of interacts with them or sees sort of like the ways in which they've influenced their idea of themselves. I think that was one that sort of broke open a lot of the book for me when I was writing it, or sort of felt very, it felt very sort of natural as it was coming out. Like I wasn't sort of like banging my head against the wall trying to be like, where is this going? It's also like a happier poem. It sort of is more interested in like the life of the him character and sort of the ways in which they navigate existence without sort of like without sort of like the more tragic elements of other characters in the book. So I think that was a one for me that I have a fondness for.
That's great. I love that poem.
Yeah.
It was also one of my favorites as a reader, and it made me want to look the character up and see them because I didn't remember them from Powerpuff Girls, but wow.
Yeah, him is a great sort of deep cut for folks that grew up with Cartoon Network. Good, yeah.
What do you most hope people take away from reading the book?
Yeah, I think for me, I want possibility to come through in people's reading experience and to take away sort of the idea or the promise of possibility. And by that, sort of thinking that possibility sort of means, you know, space for multiplicity or for contradiction or sort of holding multiple desires true and sort of also sort of thinking through with the sort of intention of like a future being possible. I think, across all of the sort of references to horror and the sort of revisions of these monster stories, there's this drive in the book that I hope people take away, that the speaker is, striving to possess the agency to find out who they are on their own terms, to be the person that they need to be or want to be, and sort of despite self-doubt, despite external violence, there's this sort of sacred sort of way of being oneself or actualizing the self that they want to be. So that's sort of, I hope hopefully people take that with themselves. And particularly I hope that, young trans people read this book and can take away that permission to see that there's also language for what they're feeling, or that they can create language that isn't there yet, and that there is like a future for them.
What do you think poetry can offer us in 2025?
Yeah, I think that it's more urgent than it's been for, I think it sort of increasingly becomes more urgent as things feel more dire or more urgent. And yeah, like I sort of think that means that the moment requires that we sort of recommit to artistic visions or the ideas of what we think art can do. I think we're living through a very violently anti-art time, and sort of, I think faced with that, faced with chaos or sort of cowardice also, and like just spite, poetry sort of offers a way to make life livable and create a path towards a world that might be livable also. I also think like when faced with the situation that we're in today, whatever you want to call it, whether you want to call it authoritarianism, fascism, tech, techno fascism, whatever you want to call it, I think there is sort of a attack that is targeted specifically on the level of language. The idea of, dissenting words or dissenting sort of modes of expression become sort of suppressed. Language is sort of politicized in this way where people attempt to make it harder to speak against the things that are happening to them and the violence that's happening to them. And I think poetry offers a way of defying that and resisting that in a way that feels very hard for those systems to break. So I think sort of actively engaging poetry on the level of being something that can be radical or being something that can be sort of resistant to those structures is what it can offer us. It offers a way of sort of surviving that and living sort of outside of that, either mentally or sort of spiritually, is you can sort of live outside of the violence and sort of create something that can withstand that maybe. Yeah. It's a question I keep asking myself too. Sort of what the role of writing is when the world is the way that it is.
Thank you for answering. I feel very mean asking it every time, but it's definitely a question I feel like we are all grappling with right now as writers. So
And I think that's an important question to ask. I think it can be very easy to like sort of fall into a motion of sort of like performing the sort of defiance or resistance is like performatively doing that. So I think sort of actively discussing it or thinking like what does that practically mean is important because yeah, for everybody it's sort of different or sort of, as the stakes become different also is yeah, what sort of tools do we as sort of a community of writers have that we can provide to each other?
speaking of, can you give our viewers a writing prompt based on Scream Queen?
Yeah, I love prompts. I love giving myself prompts. So it was very exciting to me. Yeah, so prompt I have for Scream Queen is to do some research into a scary movie that you like or you heard about, and to write down a few quotes from that movie that you find interesting or surprising. You can also, if you want to be very nerdy about it, look at the posters for the movie, and they have taglines. So sort of like the promo sort of quote that they give, and you could write that down if you want. You usually have a couple of different ones, but yeah, find some language associated with the movie. And as you're making your list, leave some space in between the sentences or the phrases from the quotes that you've pulled out. So sort of leaving some blank space. Then what you can do after you've gotten a couple of those is to write your own responses to those lines. So you can, try to finish the sentence on your own if you're like breaking the sentence up, or you can write sort of like a response to a question or write a question based on the quote that you have or something. But do this as fast as you can. So sort of, don't really try to think about it too much. It's just sort of the first thing that happens to come to your mind is write that down. And then do this until you've responded to all the quotes or all the taglines is sort of after you've sort of filled everything out. After you've done that, pull out two of your own lines, two of your responses, two of the sort of things that you've written in response to the movie's language, and then use them to sort of start a poem that's describing a childhood memory. And try to pick a childhood memory that's sort of like the opposite of the quote. So, like if you're picking like a movie about a haunted house and it's, about this sort of horrifying experience, like Paranormal Activity or something, pick a really fond childhood memory of like going to your grandparents' house, or pick a sort of a more happy moment. but start from that language that you generated in response to the horror movie. Love prompts.
I'm so
I thought
excited to try that.
you posted. I was like, yeah, love looking at prompts.
Awesome. Okay, we have 10 minutes left. I wanted to mention real quick that Elizabeth Mascari asked, what was your process for choosing this killer title? And I feel like you already kind of covered that, so we won't address it again. But could you maybe just talk a bit about your best strategies for revision?
Yeah, so I'm a huge fan of revision. Like, it's really nerdy, but that's like my favorite part of like the poem process. I know a lot of folks kind of don't like it very much. But I think, and what I try to talk about when I teach classes or whenever I'm sort of in a workshop is sort of reinforcing the idea that revision offers you sort of an opportunity to kind of reimagine or re-envision what the poem is attempting to say or attempting to do. Is it gives us an opportunity to kind of like check in with like what did you initially want, and sort of allows that sort of allows us the space also to kind of radically reimagine what it can be. So something I found really useful when I'm revising something that's sort of emotionally difficult, or sort of a poem that feels like it's been really hard to get out, is to sort of break the mystery of the poem. And what I mean by that is like I think there's sort of like a preciousness that we all carry with poems, where we're sort of trying to just get them out, trying to just sort of work towards language that we really like or a form that we really admire. But I think something that helps me in a very concrete way is to take out a piece of paper and ask myself like what is the poem about, like what is at stake, why does this poem matter to me, which feels very simple, but like there have been times when I've used this and I was like, I don't know why this poem matters to me. And this sort of makes me kind of, really push the revision in a very different way, is because if I don't know what the poem is about, or I don't know why I'm writing this poem, that says something. So I think making ourselves answer that kind of question of like, why do I care about this? Why am I writing about this experience? Or like, why am I doing this? Kind of opens us up to more opportunities to revise further.
Last question. My Swedish friend was really impressed hearing that you translated Edith. She said that that's no small feat. And we wondered how you came across Edith. And I said I'd ask that during the interview. So
Edith Södergren was a Russian-born Finnish Swedish writer who did not necessarily occupy a very like prestigious place in her life, was sort of constantly at odds with the sort of literary establishment in Finland that was writing in Swedish, and sort of had this tension of like wanting to express herself in a very sort of what we would say a very like avant-garde, very modern way. And sort of it was much later that she sort of became more prominent, then became sort of at this point somewhat analogous in terms of like there's sort of comparisons made with like with Emily Dickinson, where it's sort of this person that sort of hermetically in their own sort of place, while sort of not necessarily interacting with like a larger like literary community that way. But I was sort of really interested when I started getting into translation and looking at specifically sort of like women writers and like writers that were sort of hadn't necessarily been translated a lot into English, hadn't been sort of given the appreciation that they deserved. And as someone writing from or translating from Swedish, I was sort of thinking through like how to find folks or something. And I think I was looking at sort of like a couple different like encyclopedias or sort of compendiums of like women writers in like Scandinavia or the Nordic countries, and her name kept coming up, and it was very mysterious. Like, I mean, like it was very hard to find poems that were translated already. Like I found like a couple. Everything was like sort of in these like very literal sort of like I translated every single one of her poems, sort of like collections that were all from like the 70s or something. So like hasn't really necessarily been a lot of her work circulating around. So it sort of interested me as like, why hasn't anyone doing that? So that's sort of kind of like why I got interested. So I like found a really old interlibrary loan copy of one of her books in Swedish and sort of just got to work doing that. And it was a lot of fun. Very excited for that to come out. Also, just so people can like know about her more, a very interesting person, a very sort of like different world. Also, I think she sort of, was writing in the 19 teens and died in the 1920s. And I think just like as a writer myself, like just getting a glimpse into like what it meant to be a writer 100 years ago in sort of completely different geopolitical context, like just makes it sort of gives you some perspective on like the things we think about now, where we're like, anxiously clicking on submittable and sort of like thinking about these different sort of like very specific mundane writerly things today is like, oh, this person, had such a completely different life, and sort of reevaluate what your intentions are as a writer. That was a lot of fun.
Great. Thank you so much, CD. It was so great to talk to you and learn more about this wonderful book.
Yeah, well, thank you for spending time with it and giving space to it. Hopefully, I didn't talk too quickly, or
Totally fine.
Okay. Yeah, I'm gonna be in Arkansas in March, so it'll be cool. And then if you're here for AWP, I'd love to see. Yeah.
Absolutely. What are you coming to Arkansas for?
I'm gonna do some book tour stuff.
Oh, nice. Where?
Yeah, I'm gonna read at Pearls.
Okay. Send me details. I'll go.
Yeah. I'm gonna do that. And then I'm gonna do another thing in Little Rock with Brody. So that'll be fun.
Awesome.
But it'll be exciting. And then hopefully you make your way out to AWP.
Yeah, for sure. I will let you have the rest of your night. Thank you so much, CD. Take care.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Have a good night.
Bye.